Why has the U.S. not adopted IFRS? Chicago Booth professor Dr. Ray Ball joins me studio with his thoughts. So the Securities and Exchange Commission, of course, has sort of hit a roadblock when it comes to determining the forward guidance to U.S. companies on IFRS. Tell me, why the delay?
I think it's not so much a delay. I think it's a permanent stop. There are some fundamental reasons why the U.S. has not adopted IFRS. IFRS is, global accounting rules, and the underlying causes of the demand for global accounting rules is globalization of politics and globalization of markets, more trading across the world. But it's still true that a lot of politics is local, a lot of markets are local activity. And so the three largest economies in the world, that is the three most populous countries, India, China, and the United States, have not adopted IFRS. Why? Because the forces that are local, internal, political and economic pressures are greater there relative to countries that are smaller, okay? So in the US, the politics to some degree are local. So in some of the accounting standards, such as leases, where the political pressures on the American standard setting body are more local. The local business pressure has been to say, we want a different standard or a modified standard than the one that's being adopted internationally by the IFRS. So that's the first reason. There are different political and economic pressures. Secondly, the SEC in the United States is very much rules-based. This is a body that is very interventionist. They monitor very closely the extent to which the rules are followed. And they're very good at finding out whether or not you followed rules. So they like checking boxes. IFRS are more principles-based. And the SEC would be fundamentally uncomfortable with the notion of trying to adjudicate or monitor whether or not companies did in fact implement principles. It's not something they're good at. So I think these are the two major reasons why IFRS are not flying as far as the SEC is concerned. I think the last reason is there's a threat of loss of sovereignty. The US is very guarded about in many contexts in law and international law, and I think this is another.
Okay, now let's consider statements made in May by the SEC's chief accountant, James Schnurr. He said there is little support for the SEC to provide an option allowing U.S. public companies to prepare their financial statements under IFRS. Yet, he goes on to say, there does seem to be continued support for the objective of a single set of high-quality, globally accepted accounting standards. To say the least, these are two very conflicting statements.
They are conflicting statements, and I think the latter, the statement that there is support for a single global standard, is a conceptual, it's an idea. We all support the notion of world peace if we could get it, but of course sometimes you have to go to war to...
Right, and the concept of even globalization. We can talk about, borderless societies, but at the end of the day,
there are borders.
There are borders, and we're talking about political interests.
And so I think the support is for the idea of globalization, but when push comes to shove, you find, as we're talking about with leasing, you get local, domestic, political and economic forces bearing upon you. In a sense, they seem to be conflicting statements, but they aren't really. One is an ideal, the other is a practicality.
So why even bother engaging in this rigorous philosophical debate really at this stage? I mean, is it really a fruitful conversation to be had?
I think there's evidence that it is not. The Financial Accounting Standards Board and the International Accounting Standards Board have shelved the convergence project. The word convergence implies that you ultimately will get to the same point, and they have dropped that language. Nevertheless, they work closely together. They share a lot in common. Their standards overlap a large amount. The Financial Accounting Standards Board does have input, very strong input to the International Accounting Standards Board, but the notion that they will some stage converge has been dropped. I think they've become more realistic about that. But don't want to overemphasize that too much because, as I said, they share a lot in common and they work together a large degree.
Fabulous. So moving forward, what would you like to see happen as you continue to conduct academic research in this field?
I like the idea of there being a bit of competition. I like the idea of accounting standards competing with each other a little. So I like the idea of the US maintaining a strong standard setting body. I also like the idea of adapting some more global language to local circumstances, because the local issues will never go away. I'm happy with the way things are. I'm not a person who would preach things should be very much different, because I think that what we see tends to be in our society in equilibrium that reflects the pressures that arise in different parts of the world.